Brett, how are you?
I'm really good.
I really am looking forward to you filling me in on what happened at the last Thoughtful Discussion Group.
This was an odd one. Normally we have a topic that's some sort of esoteric thing, but this time it was, what 5 books would you not want to be without? These would be 5 books, if that was your sole source of entertainment, that you'd want to have. Entertainment, education, whatever you think would be appropriate. Typically you think about being on a desert island and which 5 books do you bring? But we don't want people bringing books that are like how to survive on a desert island, you know? So these are the 5 books that people would be most interested in enjoying for pleasure or for intellectual growth.
So of these books, was there anything that was surprising?
So one thing that was surprising is nobody wanted to bring the Bible, which I had kind of expected. It's pretty much something that a lot of people talk about bringing and reading often. So it seemed like a natural, but nobody did. And only one person had an interest in poetry. Otherwise, it was a mix of fiction and nonfiction. There was one person who selected a book that he'd never read before.
Oh, what was that book?
That was On Walden Pond by Thoreau. And the idea there was that that's a pretty well-known book, and there's a lot to be talked about in it, a lot to be understood. So even if you haven't read it yet, there's still a lot there.
So one of the books that came up was The Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. What was about that book?
That book was a feel-good book by the person who selected it, and it was a book about nature. And she said you have to read it in small bits and then think about it a lot, because it presented concepts and ideas that were that just required a lot of thought. So that really was a good book for her, because she could then step away from the book and think for a while and then come back to it.
And I see that Nabokov came up.
Yeah, it's not terribly surprising that there are philosophers in the Thoughtful Discussion Group, but yeah, Nabokov and several other Eastern European philosophers came up as again, a point of reference and something to kind of think about, get you thinking about the world in a different way.
So one title here, Unkempt Thoughts. What can you tell me about that?
Unkempt Thoughts is a cool book. I had never seen it before myself. The gentleman who brought it was describing how it's like just little snippets of ideas, little thoughts that you normally wouldn't think about, but that cause you to think about more. And some of them are funny and some of them are trite, and it's just interesting.
And how about Left Hand of Darkness?
The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. The Left Hand of Darkness is really an interesting story. It's a science fiction story about a woman coming into her own as a protagonist, and just really an insightful book about the power of women in general, and this particular woman as well. And in fact, her whole collection of books, which one person brought, me, are remarkably varying in what they cover. And so in my steamer trunk, I decided to bring her whole collection.
I see that there are collections that you had here, anthologies. What came up there?
Well, we kind of cheated. So we all like to read in the group, and so it's no surprise that everybody would want ample reading material. And one quick way to get ample reading material is to say, oh, I'd like all of Tolkien, which is volumes and volumes and volumes, or an anthology of poetry. Like the Norton Anthology is a classic collection of some of the world's greatest poems. And so to have those at hand when you're in such difficult circumstances, or when that's your only entertainment, is really helpful.
I don't know many people who read poetry. People talk about it, about maybe doing it, but don't get around, and I myself don't really get around to it.
Yeah, poetry is not something you read cover to cover the way you read a normal book, not in general anyway. And so what you might do is you might read one poem by one poet and compare it to a similarly concept poem by another poet, and see the different ways that they've taken to express their idea. And one of the things that most people don't even think about is you probably listen to poetry all the time when you listen to music.
I can see Tolkien was a big favorite. Whose was that?
I like the collected works of Tolkien, and one of the other people in the group selected The Fellowship of the Ring. They're both deep works. Well, The Fellowship of the Ring itself is just a deep work. It's got its own languages. It's got its own cultures. It's got areas that are so thrilling. She described as, I could remember being on top of the mountain and feeling the cold wind and just wanting to snuggle into my blanket as I'm reading the book. It really just sort of brought you someplace you could never ever go.
How do you think people find good books to read? Because you need to either hear about them or read a review. And I personally am out of touch, and I'm at a loss when it comes to finding a good book.
So goodreads.com is a good place to go. There are lots of people who put up reviews and what they thought of a book. But I find that if you just have got no clue at all, it's worth looking for books that have received awards. The National Book Award, books that have long been on the New York Times bestsellers. Two different angles there. The National Book Award, you're looking at books that are literarily acclaimed. The New York Times, a lot of people like to read it. So it might be trash, but everybody has fun reading it.
Right, right.
So those are two sources, but there are tons more. And if you just look for lists of what should I read this summer, or I'd like to read about building houses, or I'd like to read about a certain geography, there are tons of book lists out there that identify books on certain topics.
Now, is it just me, or are there more foreign writers who are getting on American radar now?
I think so, and the big pulse is really coming from China, where writers that are extremely popular in China are now having their works translated. And I recently read The Three-Body Problem, which was an interesting book written by a Chinese author talking about communicating with aliens. What else?
And I know that East European science fiction has its own flavor. What can you tell me about the Chinese science fiction?
Well, the Chinese science fiction, just like any other, it takes some scientific concept and examines what would happen if you could travel faster than light or whatever. And so it does that, but it also ties in the party. And that's an alien concept to Americans who don't really think that way. And the fact that the science needs to match the party. And so regardless of what the facts are, they need to match the concept of the world the party has put forward. And that's a little shocking.
Wow. Well, thanks for bringing us all these great books. We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.